Right.
Okay, and
Bring on.
and it looks like we're about 30 seconds. Yeah, we're right on time, and so I'm going to ask Leanne to take it away and get your business out of the way and introduce Dr. Moore.
All righty. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. The only announcement that I have tonight is that our June speaker has not yet officially confirmed. So I would just ask that you check back through our website to make sure that the June presentation is going to happen. And then for this evening's presentation, any questions that you might have, if you'll put them in the chat room, we'll address them at the end. And then without further ado, I'll introduce Dr. Michael J. Moore. He's a veterinary scientist at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, WHOI. His research encompasses the physiology and pathology of marine mammals. He studied the effects of trauma from the shipping and fishing industries on large whale survival welfare. And he's currently working with stakeholders to reduce the threats of such trauma to these animals. And I believe it's all pretty much summed up in his book, We Are All Whalers, and the Plight of Whales and Our Responsibility. So without further ado, Mr. Moore, or Dr. Moore, please enlighten us.
Well, thank you. So now I need to share my screen. But before I do that, I really want to apologize for being a no-show whenever it was back in March, maybe. I fell over and landed on my head on an ice patch in New Hampshire and told my wife that I'd done that. I had no recollection of it at all.
That actually occurred with the Monterey chapter, but we are benefiting from you. We're aware of that happening to you, and we are glad that you are be able to join us down here in San Diego. So yes, it's
well,
nice.
there you are. You see, I've got all the chapters scrambled up, so I'm.
No, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it.
That's okay.
All right, so I'm going to share my screen and share. I always forget to do the second half. Hit share. I'm going to do it all over again. Now you can see some flowers, hopefully, which is on Monhegan Island last summer. And now I'm going to get back into my PowerPoint and hit the project button. And you're going to see a picture of the book. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, we are good to go. So what I'm going to do here is tell you about the book and read a number of passages from it, and we can have a Q&A session afterwards. And I hope some of you may have read the book. I know one of you has at least. And so I'm very grateful for the interest in the book and the help with getting it widely circulated. My wife always says I should make sure I mention the fact that the royalties that go to the Oceanographic, because I wrote it as employee there, will, I managed to negotiate, be used for North Atlantic right whale conservation work, which is quite surprising that they actually let me do that. And I have it in writing too, so that's good. So anyway, you've got the title there, and I want to acknowledge my editor at the University of Chicago Press, Joseph Kalemia, who really rescued me and told me what I was trying to say and threw out about a third of the book and helped me write a further third, and then put me through some grueling review processes and revisions. And finally, then I got a copy editor, and here we are with a book, which was basically 2 or 3 years of my life, and kept me busy during COVID for quite a while, which was good. So I needed something to do. So this is a video I took a couple of 3 years ago now of 2 North Atlantic right whales skim feeding in Cape Cod Bay. And if you've read the book, you'll recognize this is the beginning of the preface to set the scene. I want to just read you a little bit of what I wrote. Recently, I spent an early April day in the southwestern corner of Cape Cod Bay in eastern Massachusetts with a friend. He had been at sea his entire working life, but had never knowingly been close to a right whale. His day was master of an oil tanker on the Valdez, Alaska to San Francisco, California run, where he might have been close to a North Pacific right whale. He was vastly overqualified to skipper our boat, which he did while I piloted a small drone to measure the lengths and widths of the many feeding North Atlantic right whales we had found in a small area. There was no wind that day. The sea was like a mill pond. It was crisp, cold, sunny, and quiet. And we shut down the motor, drifted, watched, and listened. As each animal surfaced, exhaled, and immediately inhaled, we listened to the unique cadence of their breaths, and we watched their steady progress through the water with their mouths wide open, filtering the clouds of food close to the surface. Periodically, they slowly closed on the boat, and we could see into their open mouths, with small eddies of water peeling away from their lips. Much larger eddies formed in their wakes as their powerful tails and bodies pushed them along. They made tight turns using their huge flippers and tails as rudders to keep themselves within the food patches. This went on all day. As the sun started to sink behind the cliffs on the nearby western shore of Cape Cod Bay, their creamy white upper jaws, just visible above the surface, turned to a vibrant golden hue. It was a peaceful, majestic, timeless sight, and a huge privilege to be permitted to study these animals. So here we have a photograph from a drone again, a still of a North Atlantic right whale called callosity bat. Now, normally right whales have callosities on their heads, around the blowholes, and above and below their eyes, and maybe on the lower lips here. But this one has some on its back as well. And he's feeding on his side. This was 2 years ago. Now, just last week, we ran into them again in Cape Cod Bay, and there he was, still feeding on his side with his callosities on his back. There's a human here that's got a scale for it. So why whales? I don't have to convince you guys, but they're certainly smart. They're air-breathing mammals. And sperm whales dive on a single breath for more than an hour. Right whales not so long, but they've got extraordinary adaptations for eating these swarms of copepods and sometimes krill. And that's what this guy's doing here on his side with his mouth open. This is the lower jaw here. Upper jaw is up here. And there's the eyeball on the right. And this is the rack of baleen on the right. And this, you can't really see the hole from this perspective, but where the arrow is, there's a big orifice now created by the upper jaw, the walls of baleen, and the lower jaw and lips, such that this is the entrance to the vacuum cleaner that's being pushed through the water by its tail and body here. And the copepods get swallowed up and the water comes out so that it's concentrated by draining the water out of the mouth, and the copepods fall up as a slurry to be swallowed as food. So, before I get into right whales, I need to set a little bit of perspective. And so on the left here, there's a photograph of myself with a guy called Hal Whitehead, and Kathy Ingham, and Nikki Davis, and Hannah, as she was then, Clark. Now she's half asleep upstairs because it's past our bedtime here. So this was in 1979 when we were working on a small boat in Newfoundland doing photo ID and other aspects of humpback whale biology. Hal was doing his thesis out of Cambridge at the time. A few years later, after I gained this experience and a degree in veterinary medicine, I was hired by the International Whaling Commission to work on one of these whaling ships in Iceland to record and document how efficient explosive harpoons were when they were killing fin whales, which they just stopped doing only very recently. And so one of the things I say in the book was, what is worse for a whale, an explosive harpoon or entanglement? One of the big surprises in my life is that the answer to this question is neither obvious nor clear-cut. And so in hindsight, this experience was, if you like, a positive control of my career in terms of understanding how, with intent, how humans can kill whales remarkably efficiently. Now that may sound a little bit sacrilegious, but hopefully I'll be able to explain what I mean by that. So in the next slide, I show 3 ways that humans kill whales with harpoons in Iceland. And one of the things I discovered in that study was that the average time from when you pull the trigger with that explosive harpoon to the animal being dead is 4 minutes. Much later, here's a right whale on the beach, been carved up with propeller by a big ship all the way along, and then scavenged by great white sharks after that. This guy died in hours, if not minutes. He had a major pneumothorax as part of the trauma that he was subjected to. Whereas this right whale here has got rope in the mouth, and I'll show you a little bit more about this case in a little bit, and coming out of the right side of the mouth, over the blowhole, making a hell of a mess of the blowhole, and then killing the tissues in the left flipper. You can see how white the flipper is. Shouldn't be visible there, but it is. So I guess I need to give you a sense of the title. Why are we all whalers and have a responsibility for the plight of whales? Well, whaling can be defined as the action or practice or business of catching whales, nothing about intent. So really, I'm showing you in this slide 3 types of whaling: intention with explosion of harpoons, and by mistakes for vessel collisions and rope entanglement. So these, I'm going to move this slide here. That's better. These fatal entanglements that take 6 months to die, I really think that the consumers who drive the maritime industries that enable vessel collisions and fishing gear are whalers by default, but not obviously by design. So that's the basis of the thesis of the book, that we as consumers, whether it be of goods that we think we need or that we want, coming by ship, fuel, vessel, vehicles, toys, you name it, we all enable the industries that are causing the problems with these animals in this photograph. The vessels that are bringing stuff from us overseas, and the traps that are catching, in this case, lobster or snow crab, in your case, Dungeness crab. So this map gives a little bit of a plot of the book. And so as an undergraduate, I spent some time in the Faroe Islands studying the pilot whale hunt. And actually, if you go back to the 1982 issue of one of the issues of the Whale Watcher, you'll find an article by myself and others about the pilot whale drive in the Faroe Islands, which is still very much in the news. I grew up in the UK. I've talked about the time we spent in Iceland looking at fin whale harpoon studies. And then I spent time with Hal up in Newfoundland and Labrador as well. A lot of right whale work in the Northwest Atlantic, humpbacks. I worked with Hal down in Silver Bank. But also I spent some time in Alaska with the folks killing bowhead whales up there. And we'll talk about them in just a little bit. But again, Gulf St. Lawrence with right whales as well. So that's the ball field, if you like, as to where the book is set largely. So to focus on Alaska just a little bit more, I went there because I wanted to learn from the whalers, the Inupiat whalers, how to take these large baleen whales apart without machinery. Because very often when I was working as a diagnostician to take large whales apart, we didn't have heavy machinery. And I really felt that I wanted to learn from these guys who learned from their ancestors how to do this over thousands of years. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of native whaling. And I guess the hoodie this guy on the left is wearing sums up some of their attitudes of we are the whale because they are made of whale by what they hunt and consume. And any idea that you shouldn't be killing wildlife up in Barrow and around North Slope soon evaporates if you go into the grocery store there and have to fork out $14 for a box of cornflakes. and it's probably 24 now. But, you know, there's no trees, there's no agriculture. It is what it is in terms of seals and fish and whales. So here is Craig George, who's a scientist, has been there for decades, talking with one of the old whalers. And what this photograph represents to me is the mutual respect between the industry, if you like, the artisanal industry anyway, and the science as they go back and forth. And this is a relationship that's missing on the East Coast, and something that I feel very strongly about in terms of trying to do better in how we relate to the stakeholders, whether they be fishermen or mariners or developers of offshore wind or whatever is the conversation at the moment. So essentially, these images represent a durable, sustainable interaction of hundreds and thousands of years, something that we currently lack on the East Coast and working towards. I haven't really given you a sense of the species diversity we have in right whales. You've got the North Pacific right whale up around your part and further north. We've got the North Atlantic, which used to be up in the Northeast Atlantic as well. Occasionally these guys still go over there. Then the Southern right whale, which has done rather better post-whaling. They were also knocked down heavily to a few hundred as well. So in the North Atlantic, the primary stresses have been 1,000 years of harpoon whaling, starting with the Basque, and fishing and shipping trauma in more recent times. The slow open mouth feeding behavior that I showed you earlier has made them easy to hunt and susceptible to vessel and rope trauma. As I said, southern right whales were also heavily impacted by harpoon whaling, but a critical statistic here is that 90% of the human population lives in the northern hemisphere. So there's been far less recent anthropogenic trauma for the southern right whale, and they've come back at around 7% a year, such that there's probably 20,000 southern right whales now, whereas there are still less than 350 North Atlantic right whales at this point. And we'll get into those numbers in just a minute. So here's another perspective of a North Atlantic right whale that's skim feeding. And here you can see the callosities and then the baleen and the lower lips. And these callosities are critical for the photo identification. Just like a humpback whale, you look at the tail. For a right whale, you look at the head. And you can't see them individually, but there are lots of whale lice that are highlighting the horny protuberances that make up the unique callosity pattern for each animal. So we're able to get a good sense of the life history as these animals are seen through the years, with or without a calf, with or without entanglement, who they're hanging out with, and so on. So the anatomy of how they get entangled is very often that it's kind of like floss getting stuck in the baleen, and they spin and they wrap it around the rostrum, or it goes around the flippers and or the tail. So that's a serious part of the trauma that they suffer from through their lives. So what does this mean in terms of what the entanglement risk really comes down to? This sketch here, done by my buddy Natalie Renier, gives a sense of how it used to be and how it currently is, and how it needs to move on for lobster fishing, where we have, especially offshore, we'll have these traps in a row, or they call them a patrol of multiple, up to about 40 traps offshore. And they have a ground line between traps and an end line at either end to retrieve it. And the traps are retrieved for renewing the bait and harvesting the catch. It used to be with these dotted lines that they like to have floating ground lines, so that the ground lines didn't get hung up on rocks, chafe on the gravel and so on. But around 14 years ago, we banned floating ground lines, so it's been sinking since then, but you still have a major entanglement risk from the end lines. And indeed, the ground lines have a residual risk, because when the food is on the bottom, where it sometimes is, the whales will often feed on their side to get right in tight, so they could still scoop up this ground. But one of the things we'll talk about in just a minute is how these lines can be actually removed with some technological alternatives. We'll get into that in just a minute. So entanglement can suck the life out of these whales. So this is one animal about 12 years ago now, who was photographed from the air, and 10 months later was seen again having acquired this entanglement in line. It was lobster line. And so the mouth is shut here, but wrapped up in the baleen is a bunch of line. And so the white curve here gives a sense of the body outline before it was entangled, and the red curve, and I've repeated that on this picture here, the red curve is the new outline of the animals. There's a major loss of body condition with these chronic, and in this case, ultimately lethal entanglement. But the sublethal entanglements are just as important, in as much as if you think you're going to get a calf out of the bottom picture, you're wrong. It's just not going to be able to have body condition and the energy stores to create the calf in the first place, or especially suckle it and lactate for the time required, to the year or so that it takes to wean them. And so all of the current management processes that are focused on are all about mortality. And yet the MMPA, the Endangered Species Act, they both say that, you know, surprise, surprise, you need to have recovery as well. And for recovery, you need calves. And so there's really been a huge disconnect in terms of the logic as to how these regulations have been enforced, such that they've been ignoring largely the sublethal trauma and how that works. We've got a paper coming out tomorrow, actually, that describes how fatter, bigger right whales produce better, more for longer calves than the skinnier ones do. So hopefully, I'm an optimist, the government might actually pay more attention to the sublethal trauma as well as the lethal trauma. So anyway, with that, I want to dig down a little bit more into one of the issues that I brought to the table in the book, being trained first as a veterinarian, then as a scientist. This kind of set up a seesaw of endless good-natured conflict in my brain, because veterinarians are expected to be advocates, and scientists are expected to be the objective analyst. And one of the things that conflict gave was the question of the extent to which I should be telling the story of how these whales were dying, how they were in pain and suffering, because a veterinarian sure as hell should be doing that and trying to fix it and prevent it. So ultimately, and we're getting into the sort of the bugaboo of anthropomorphism. And so ultimately, I resolved that anthropogenic trauma begets and deserves anthropomorphism, because, you know, we're putting our own needs and wants on top of whatever these animals are doing and thinking. So latterly, I've become more and more comfortable in that regard. So I'm going to read you now a piece from the back of the book, which is one of two postludes, we call them. And this rather grainy photograph is of an animal called number 2301. Now, and it's her mom. in 1993. This is pre-digital. So this, and what I've done here is I've anthropomorphized heavily by, oh, excuse me, I hit the wrong button there. Go backwards here. There we go. Talking in the presumed voice of this animal 2301. Once my calf was weaned, I went back to work building up my body condition, hoping to get fat enough to have another calf soon, if I found good food, or some years later if I didn't. One of the things my mother had told me time and time again was to be wary of ships, boats, and fishing gear. The ships were very noisy and confusing because we could hear them for hours and hours as they got closer, and we got to the point where we simply ignored them. Then, usually as they went by, the noise slowly faded away again, but sometimes as it got louder and louder, the noise dropped off abruptly, which was a great but deceptive relief. My mother had explained that it meant that the bow of the ship was shielding the noise from the propeller and engine, which were at the back of the ship, and her advice was to dive as fast as possible to avoid being hit. My mother also warned me about rope. Fishing boats had all kinds of different ropes and nets. The ones that dragged nets weren't a major threat to us, but they did a number on the fish-eating whales and dolphins. The biggest issue for us was rope that went from the surface of the ocean to the bottom, where it was attached to one or more wire mesh cages containing crabs and lobsters. We also had to watch out for long curtains of net stretched along the bottom with weights to keep them in place and floats to keep the net standing up in the water. When I was a calf, I used to try and play with ropes, and I would get a serious telling off from my mother. So here she is in 2003. Now, 2004. Once I was weaned, I found it really hard to miss the ropes when I was so intent on finding the best food patch and sticking with it, twisting and turning all the while. Often I would brush against a rope running from the bottom to the surface. Usually it would just glide by, but sometimes I would get hooked up in it. I learned to stop and back off, although the temptation to twist and turn and thrash was sometimes irresistible. I picked up a few minor scars. When it happened, my calf had been weaned for less than an hour, so I was still skinny and hungry all the time. I found a really good patch of food. I can't see where I was. I ran into some fatty light line. Before I knew it, I was tangled up, and I had it in my mouth over my blowhole and tightly wrapped around my left flipper. I'm ashamed to say that I panicked. I twisted, turned, rolled, thrashed, and charged around like a crazy whale. I was able to get the trap hooked on a rock and broke that off, but I was still left with an ugly mess of rope. I could feel all the knots and twists. Every time I swam, I felt fresh stabbing pain, especially around my left flipper. I could see the rope cutting into the flesh, and eventually I felt it start to cut into the bone. My left blowhole was becoming increasingly useless. I carried that rope around for weeks and months. My left flipper felt like it was dead. Lice had spread out around my blowhole and left flipper, and I was losing all that beautiful fat I'd been laying down for my next calf. I felt desperate. The last thing I remember was heading south to warmer water, as I was getting really cold with no fat between the water and myself. So with that, flip back into the more clinical numbers again. But I feel very strongly that these animals need that anthropogenic, anthropomorphic voice, because that's what we're doing to them, and it's not right. So anyway, this graph here with the number of whales on the y-axis and time from 1990 on the x-axis shows what's been going on. So things were getting slowly better. We were making more calves than we were killing larger animals and calves, actually, up until around 2010, 2011. And then we've had a crash. And part of that is because of an increased mortality up in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, because the animals moved up there from the Bay of Fundy and Gulf of Maine to chase the food as the water warmed in the Gulf of Maine. So this animal here was drowned in snow crab gear. Now, snow crab gear are the ropes 3/4 of an inch or more in diameter, and big buoys, and wrapped a bunch around the flipper. things are not good. And so we had a major die-off in 2017 and 2019 involving both Canadian and US ports. And this serious decline began at that time. So I'll read a little bit more from the preface. Over the past millennium, North Atlantic right whale has only just avoided extinction, first from deliberate hunting and now inadvertently from the harvesters and mariners. We've reached a tipping point. The right whale species cannot continue to withstand the mortality and morbidity it suffers from the fishing gear entanglement and vessel collision. We must also consider what each individual is going through as it struggles with persistent rope entanglement. To solve the problem, we need to have the understanding, commitment, and optimism to carry through with what has to be done by fundamentally changing fishing and shipping practices. But we also need to make these changes in ways that are sensitive to the lives of the humans that work in vessels at sea and harvest seafood. Both industries have already borne substantial costs in the name of right whale conservation with inadequate results. Right whales are a special example of mammals that have evolved to thrive in an unforgiving environment and are specialized in diverse and remarkable ways to exploit specific aquatic resources and environments. We must be the same. The challenge is to find solutions that are sustainable both for whales and for humans, dependent upon these marine industries. Later, the missing link is consumers who do not know enough to demand a seafood product that is caught in a manner that protects whale populations and shields individual whales from the major animal welfare concern that rope entanglement entails, but also maintains viable and sustainable trap fishing industries. Were we to take the perspective of our grandchildren 50 years in the future, we might respond to our current actions in one of two ways. One, how could they have all been so short-sighted as to demand affordable lobster and crab rolls and cheap shipping of goods from overseas, despite the fact that they knew that the North Atlantic right whale species was heading for extinction? All that we have now are the bones of a few skeletons hanging in museums up and down the east coast of North America. Or, finally, they all saw that there was a way for whales, fisheries, and ships to coexist. It just took some legislative, regulatory, and political honesty and fortitude, enforcement of existing regulations, government investment, compromise, industrial ingenuity, and consumer education. As a scientist, I know that it's beyond urgent that we introduce much more widespread measures to mitigate large whale trauma caused by vessels and fishing gear. As a veterinarian, I see the often long, drawn-out trauma to individual right whales caused by ropes from fishing gear as utterly unacceptable. Do we have the individual and political will to make it right? Government regulations regarding how many animals can die each year are not being enforced adequately. The balance of political power between the seafood industry and the conservation and animal welfare lobbies is understandably heavily skewed to support the coastal communities that depend on the seafood industry for bringing cash flow to the region. Nevertheless, fishermen have been burdened and fatigued by years of whale conservation-driven mandatory gear modifications, while the problem of whale trauma has continued to get worse. If the government fails to make its regulations work for either the fishing industry or the whales, what can we as individuals do? So the sketch on the left shows how whales get entangled in the end lines that I showed you earlier. The right image shows how we can replace the end line with an acoustic release, allowing a buoyant system to bring the gear to the surface when required. A record of the trap deployment location and/or the acoustics also allow the owner and other trap fishers and mobile gear operators to detect the traps to avoid conflicting with them. We also need to mandate that ships slow down over much broader areas than currently. So I've been working with a colleague, many colleagues, to set up a series of workshops to promote this on-demand trap retrieval. The challenges are to make it compatible with profitable fisheries. It's got to be safe and efficient, and to fulfill the tasks of trap retrieval and location required by the stakeholders. So one system that we've been using quite a bit is a coiled, bagged, or spooled rope from the trap that floats to the surface and allows the trap to be retrieved in the traditional manner with a hauler. And the spool release is shown in the right-hand image here. This animation shows a vessel deploying. Oh, it's kind of sticky on the throttle there. So there's no end line there, and this is an inflatable bag. Comes back with his acoustic trigger to bring it up to the surface. There it is. So it all looks nice, and we've actually been working with manufacturers to build and improve and deploy and train folks to use this stuff. But most of the industry is entrenched in current practices, and they complain about the cost and the inefficiency and the safety about these on-demand technologies. But just recently, for the first time in federal waters, folks were fishing ropelessly. It was the permit was late, and it was only a few days, but it was the beginning of what I see as a really important step. How we're going to turn this really bad problem around. So I had a lot of support from SeaWorld, and other folks are giving money too. And we've been working with these fishery engineers and other NGO colleagues and commercial fishermen to define, refine these on-demand systems. And we've been working with inshore and offshore lobster fishers in the Gulf of Maine. And right now in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, there's a active, committed commercial ropeless fishery going on for snowpack, which is huge. So what's the answer here? And I have no real sense of where it's going to go at the moment, because we're still in the trenches trying to figure it out and work with the industries involved. But we consumers do demand that the shipping and fishing industries deliver the goods we need and want. And the consequent trauma to large whales does, in my mind, make us all whalers. So either consumers could demand and pay for ethical fixed fish fishing gear and shipping practices, or the status quo is that our current socioeconomic priorities will bring the North Atlantic right whale species to extinction in a few decades. It all comes down to communicating what we know and care about. And I appreciate your time and listening to what I know and what I care about, and I'm sure you do too. The challenge is to bring this to a broader audience. And I've sold thousands of books, I think. I'll know more in a few months. It's coming out as paperback in the fall. But I need to sell millions if this is going to really make a difference. And we're in a time of incredible conflict and conflicting agendas. And I don't begin to pretend that this is the biggest problem in the globe right now, because it probably isn't. But it is actually something of a microcosm of the attitude that I'm asking for would bring more peace in the world. And that's something that I do believe very strongly, that mutual respect for humans, for these animals, and for each other is something that we've lost and we need to regain. And going back to the words we've had about the folks in Alaska and Utqiagvik and Barrow, there is mutual respect up there between the animals and the humans, and that's something that we need to find in these different scenarios. So with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and talk about things.
Okay, well, we have some questions available for you in the chat room, and I'll read these to you. You don't have to worry about them. I'll read them to you. So Tom Jefferson, one of our members and scientists here in San Diego, asks, how has the pandemic and resulting supply chain affected the North Atlantic right whale population? Have you seen any evidence of a reduction of mortality during this time?
It's a really good question, and I don't really want to answer it because I'm going to whisper yes, but that's fatal, as it were. So things have quietened down quite a bit. We've had some significant vessel strike problems in the US, with a couple of calves being hit last year. Nothing yet this year. Probably there's an animal called Snowcone who had a calf, and a calf was, I think in 2020, was killed with 2 different vessel strikes. She then got pregnant again that fall and entangled and delivered a calf late December in 2021. She showed up in Cape Cod Bay 2 weeks ago with the calf, looking kind of skinny, but they're both still alive. And so she's obviously putting it out for the calf, and she's still entangled. She's got a bad wrap around the head. So there's a reduction in trauma potentially, but it's not gone away. That's for sure. So I hope that answers Tom's question.
And then, well, he will follow up, I would imagine. And Jaden has similar to the pandemic, and she's asking, during the pandemic, was there an increase or decrease in the demand for lobster and deploying lobster traps? And then how did that affect the whale population?
Right. Well, certainly with all the restaurants closed, things shut down for those guys pretty well. Right now, they're getting around $17 a pound for lobster. And part of that is because locally there's been a much broader closure than we've had. Closures in Cape Cod Bay now in state waters since 2015, but last year they brought in a closure for all Massachusetts state waters. The restaurants have opened up again. There was some boat sort of over the transom sales to home consumers locally here that helped out a little bit with the market. But it's been rocky for everybody, obviously. But I can't say that we've necessarily been able to document how much of a change COVID has done to the trauma risk. It's certainly business as usual now, I think, for sure. So it's not going to be a major boost, because relatively short-lived and so on, but it certainly did change things somewhat. Where in federal waters, there was regulations that allowed fishing in otherwise closed areas using the ropeless traps, the on-demand traps, for offshore Gulf of Maine, or offshore Maine, which was never taken up because there was no federal permit issued to do it, even though it was allowed in theory. One of the complications there was that Maine ports can say whether or not they want to land lobster wherever, and there was a majority decision that they didn't want to deal with this on-demand fishing system. So it's a complicated, evolving scenario. As I said earlier, we did have Massachusetts federal waters being fished ropelessly last week, end of April. So that was historic. It was really exciting. And
going in a slightly different direction, Ganel wants to know, are there attempts at developing and administering effective sedatives still ongoing for entangled whales? Are attempts at developing and administering effective sedatives still ongoing for entangled, so we can calm them down a little bit?
Yeah, well, that sort of begs the broader question of the value of disentanglement. And we are still equipped and ready to use the sedatives. We developed that system 20 years ago now. And actually, the system was first tested with Dawn and Delta in the Sacramento River when we delivered antibiotics to those 2 humpbacks. We've used it periodically, but it's cumbersome in as much as you need to get a good dose estimate for the whale in terms of how heavy it is. So you've got to fly it with photogrammetry with a drone. We were doing guesswork prior to that, but now we've got better tools for sure. So Snowcone for instance, I was telling you about was a candidate for sedation, but the trepidation was to whether to intervene at all with that animal with the young calf, because we didn't want to, risk damaging the calf or putting the mother off her milk or whatever. So we were hoping to, now she's up around here, do some, and we were gearing up to do some sedation work, but the animals moved on again now, and they never got to the animal in good weather because the weather's been horrible ever since Christmas, really, up here. And so the systems are available, the willingness to use it, the skills are there, crews are trained, but we haven't used it in a number of years for a number of logistical, practical reasons. And, the drug, sedating an animal at sea like that is not risk-free for sure. And so we tend to be reluctant to use it early enough. And then when we do use it, it's too late, they die anyway. So it's catch-22 for sure.
Have you found as a veterinarian, because I know marine mammals are more obligate inhalers and terrestrial mammals are obligate exhalers or something, there's a little difference in how you sedate marine mammals, particularly whales and dolphins. So would sedatives be contraindicated where it might work in a cow or a horse, but not in a whale?
Well, absolutely. And certainly we were very cognizant of that risk right from the get-go. So the way we approached it with, anesthesiologists from SeaWorld and other colleagues was to be very conservative in the doses we used. And we slowly ramped up the dose until we got a behavioral change without causing any problems of inhalation of water or whatever. And I think probably I'm to blame for the use of the word sedation in the first place. I think it is an overstatement of what we're actually doing with these animals. Essentially, we're making them less agonistic, than they're more approachable. It's kind of like a friendly, gentle drunk rather than anybody who's actually ready for a procedure in a hospital, say, for instance. So we're not putting these animals into some kind of dopey state. We're more just taking the edge off them, I think. So
you're not tranquilizing them, you're just buying them a beer.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. All right. Well, that's all. That's pretty cool. Let me see here. George, one of our board members, says, I think the default assumption is that whales get entangled inadvertently. I've seen videos of dolphins engaging in play with long strands of kelp. Is it possible that whales are seeking out these lines for play and then getting entangled?
Yeah. Well, certainly there's descriptions of right whales playing in kelp in South Georgia, southern right whales, from the 1920s, from the British scientists who went down there. So I think juveniles of many species are more curious and inquisitive, and absolutely, I think that could be part of it. But also, skim feeding right whales are pretty oblivious, and so they can blunder into stuff pretty easily as well. Although, having said that, we do a lot of drone work with these guys, and we often just park the boat and go off and fly the drone, and the whales come over to us quite regularly. And we get to the point, well, we could just get out of the way, but on the other hand, I don't want to put that boat in gear. And they will, they never hit us. They'll be coming straight for us, wide open mouths, and they'll just quietly just curve away and go underneath the boat, look around the back, or sometimes they circle it. So they're very spatially aware. And so maybe it is largely a play thing. I don't know. But
I guess that goes along with a question that I personally had, and that when you were doing your slides, and that drone picture of the whale with its mouth open where we couldn't see the actual entrance made me think about how well do you think they can see in front of them? Obviously, you've kind of hinted at that answer,
Yeah.
but are they looking at prey, and therefore might they see a rope? I guess I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, well, they can certainly see around the corner a bit. I'm not sure they can see their rostrum because the baleen's going to be in the way. But the eyes are on the fattest part of the head, if you like. So there's some opportunity there. I think the primary sensation at the front end is the small hairs they have. And, we have a paper that's actually been accepted that suggests that the hairs can sense the vortices that may be different when you've got a soup of copepods in front of you as opposed to just clear water. So maybe they can't see the rope coming. It's possible. But Scott Krause did some work with different colored ropes, and red ropes seemed to be more visible to them, and they were avoiding the red rope, well, the model red rope that was unentangleable rope because it was stiff pipes essentially. So there's an awful lot of ignorance about how they find these copepods so efficiently, and B, the biomechanics of how they consume it and the entanglement risk. It's all embarrassingly poorly understood.
Yeah, and I don't think those people who work in the field probably don't necessarily think it's embarrassing. It's just very difficult to do solid science. But
it is a huge challenge, but it does get embarrassing when you're in court. I mean, last year, about this time of year, actually, there was this lawyer for a fishermen's union that basically said, "What do you mean you don't know how much food a right whale eats? How ridiculous is that?" And we've got a current paper that's in review where we're looking at the fundamentals of energetics models for right whales in terms of how much energy they bring in on a daily basis through their feeding versus how much they lose for basal metabolism, but also the non-evolved costs such as drag from entanglement. And ironically, we've got a better number for entanglement drag than we do for any of the physiology.
Yeah, that's pretty incredible. We have a question about, have you seen orcas interacting negatively with right whales?
Yeah, there's not a lot of orcas on the East Coast where these right whales are, but there is a famous collection of photographs by a tuna spotter pilot called Wilderness Dave. I forget his real name now, but he came across southeastern Nantucket, a rosette of right whales with their heads all together and the tail sticking out, beating the hell out of a bunch of killer whales. So they circle the wagon and create this corral, essentially. If they had a calf, the calf would have been in the middle. So there is some killer whale scarring, but very little on right whales, much more on humpbacks. And so I think these guys are pretty tough. They're powerful, they're tough, and they don't give up. They're very stubborn animals.
How about any thoughts on the potential effects on the North Atlantic right whales should the Gulf Stream change or fail? I guess this is a climate change.
Yeah. Well, we've already seen a sort of prelude for that in what went on in the Gulf of Maine, which was one of the warmest, fastest warming bodies of water in the last 10, 20 years, such that the Bay of Fundy habitat for right whales collapsed, and they haven't been there in significant numbers for 10 years now. It used to be that you go up there and that's where we went because they were so predictable, but they're not anymore. So now they're up in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and they could well be in the Straits of Belle Isle and southern Labrador within the next 10 years if this carries on. So yeah, it's a major change to their migration pattern. We don't know necessarily if this is a short-term thing or it's a cyclical thing, but they're very, very good at finding where their prey is. So if there is adequate prey field, they'll find it. That's my suspicion. But we're not very good at predicting when and where that's going to be. So that changes our ability to conserve the animals. And again, it brings in the necessity of a much broader based parameters than would make sense economically. We have to be much more aggressive in terms of the areas that they're willing to put under restrictions when the animals are around. And I've said now for a while that vessel speed restrictions should be continental shelf wide from Florida to Newfoundland. And there shouldn't be any rope in the water column in the Gulf of Maine, period. Nobody wants to hear that.
I had a couple of my own questions. Early, you showed callosities on the back, which were sort of unusual. And then later you had a drone picture of and where you talked about callosities again. And I noticed there was just an amazing amount of symmetry, it seemed like, in that particular photo. Is that something that we see? Are the callosities symmetrical?
No, I mean, sometimes they can be, sometimes they're not. So we described the classes as continuous and broken. So if they're continuous, they just carry on as a lump. And quite often the continuous ones can be quite symmetrical, but the broken ones have what we call islands of callosities, and very often they can be unilateral. And you can get a continuous sort of sweep going down the right hand and an island on the left, and so on. So it varies.
So sometimes they've reported that gray whales have a preference of feeding on a left side or right side. These guys aren't really hitting the bottom, probably, so they don't knock.
That's not true, actually. When the food's on the bottom, they are on the bottom. And
okay.
There's been an analysis of when do you see mud on the heads of right whales, and there's a couple of papers on it. And most habitats, there is mud sightings, and so that they have to be. And I think they're largely on their sides because they can get the baleen closer into the mud on their sides than they could if they were skimming along on their chins.
Okay, and I have two more, and then I don't see anything else showing up in the, but I wanted to ask you if they use the acoustical release, and I think maybe a later slide after I wrote this question down, but if I do an acoustical release, do I leave any ghost gear on the bottom, or do I recover everything?
You recover everything.
Okay.
I think the risk of ghost gear will probably be less if we do ever transition to on-demand gear, partly because one of the major causes of ghost gear is storm-driven loss of gear by it being moved by the swells, and that's all about frontal drag of the vertical rope. If there's no vertical rope, there's no frontal drag. And so we've noticed in the trials we've been doing that I think we actually we're working on a talk right now, and we need to get the denominator, but we have 8 cases of gear moving, which I think is really very low. And one of the things that can happen is that the technology on the gear enables you to find it much more easily. So we had a guy who lost his gear and tracked it down 5 miles away from where it got to. A dragger had taken it back. So there is some very significant knock-on benefits of this technology if people will just use it. And they will just use it when it becomes a requirement and affordable. And so right now, each unit's worth $4K or something like that. And I've got a couple of projects that I've currently commissioned on the West Coast, one on the East, where we're talking about a few $100s rather than a few $1,000s. And if we can do that that will be a major step forward in the challenge of making it all real.
And I guess my final question, and then I probably will pitch it back to Leanne, is kind of on a personal note, but early in my life, I had aspired to be a veterinarian. So I'm quite interested in how you, kind of your personal story on how you went from being a veterinarian and found your way to having such compassion for these marine mammals, and you know, how did you get to be a whale doctor?
Well, I never really enthused about being a dog and cat doctor, and I can't really explain it. My sister asked me when I was about 16, what was I going to do with my life? And I said, I don't know. I never really thought about it much. And both my brother and my dad and his dad were all MDs. And she said, well, why don't you become a veterinarian? I said, oh, that's a good idea. I'll do that. So, you know, I can't exactly claim any great, what should we say, mission or calling or avocation. It was just trying to keep my sister happy when she was giving me dinner. And so, and she was 10 years older than I was. She was young and so on. But so I did just that. And I went to Cambridge, which wasn't a particularly good vet school, but it was a good academic school. So I got trained quite well academically. And there was plenty of opportunity for offbeat things to do. And what I really, really enjoyed about the veterinary training was that it gave you a unique breadth of understanding of form, function, and dysfunction in a much wider range of animals than an MD does. And I still didn't do much in the invertebrate zone, but I came out of that pretty well trained in form, function, and dysfunction, and that is actually quite valuable as a scientist too. And so when I applied to do a PhD at the Oceanographic, they were kind of shocked that I wanted to go there, but they were also quite excited because I was a bigger fish in a smaller bowl, I guess is the answer. So yeah. I could write my own ticket.
Well, I really appreciated. I appreciated the dialogue we had before the official meeting, and I found the presentation to be phenomenal. And thank you for your time. And I'll give you back to Leanne to close this out.
Cool. Thank you for your time and interest.
Yeah, just thank you for staying up late with us, and thank you for bringing all of this stuff and information in your book to us. I wish you success in your future or your next book, and that comes together as well.
Yeah, well,
as this one.
It's in the frying pan right now, and I haven't really. I'm getting on a plane on Saturday, and I think I might try and sketch out a draft outline and we'll see where it goes. But
yeah,
my wife's been poking me. She's quite irresistible. So.
She can make your life easier or harder, I guess.
Both actually. But yeah, it's one of those. Can I really commit to doing this all over again? Because it is a lot of work.
Yeah.
And,
yeah.
It's got to be good, because if it's not good, it won't get published anyway, unless I publish it. Which the blessing of having a professional publishing system behind you is immeasurably important, and the fortune and the good luck I got of being in that situation was something that at the time I couldn't believe that it was actually happening, and I still don't. So it's hugely valuable, and I got a meeting with Joe in a few weeks to talk about the next one, which is exciting. And he may tell me to get lost too, so let's see.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for your time, and maybe we'll see you next year with your next book.
I give it a next year.
A little longer than that.
I think 3 years seems to be about right, because basically it took a year to publish it. You got to time it right, because they want it to come out in the fall, so it's on the Christmas list is what they do.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I just saw hello from Baja, Mexico.
Oh, cool.
And then
Well,
there's a
okay.
listener called Tokyo Jim. I don't know if that means he's listening to us from Tokyo or if that's his nickname. No, okay. All righty. Well, thank you all for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
See ya.
Take
Bye-bye.
care. Bye-bye.